Hello fight fans, I'm James Smith. We're going to tackle one of the most important issues in all of sport and certainly all of boxing, performance-enhancing drugs. We're at the horse riding facility of Dr. Margaret Goodman, who is the president and board chairperson for VADA, the Voluntary Anti-Doping Association, who has a lot to say about this subject. Whatever goes on in sport permeates into boxing, obviously, performance-enhancing drugs. And it's something you're passionate about. You're the president and board chairman of VADA. Tell us about VADA.
Well, the Voluntary Anti-Doping Association was something that I created, I'm trying to think, it was probably the end of 2011 when it kind of came into being after researching the issue for several months. I was writing for the Ring magazine at the time. I had a column called The Fight Doctor, and I decided to do a follow-up article on P.E.Ds, performance-enhancing drugs in boxing. And I started to talk to more and more individuals, and I finally understood that we weren't doing enough, and that no commission was really doing stringent enough testing on the athletes to determine if they were really abusing performance-enhancing drugs, and we weren't stopping the cheaters. And just testing fighters before or after a fight right then and there with inadequate drug panels, not including the substances that fighters are using, was no way to really determine if we were catching the cheaters or not. It was like the tip of the iceberg. If somebody turned up positive, and I still believe that the case, if they turn up positive, it's a rarity, and you're missing probably, I don't know what the percent would be, but you're missing most of the athletes that are using. So we created VADA not really to test fighters so much, but to offer an educational system where people could learn, especially the media, learn more about performance-enhancing drugs and how they're being used in boxing and mixed martial arts.
Explain to the people around the country and listening around the world that, you know, boxing in this country is state regulated. Who is testing and what are they testing for and how are they testing?
Well, that's the other problem, and it's just like everything. It's just like healthcare in boxing is some commissions will do MRI tests, some will do ophthalmologic exams, and others won't do any of that. Some won't even check for HIV, you know, so you've got that variance from commission to commission. It's regulated very much like horse racing. And a funny thing is, another reason why I kind of got into this was when I left the athletic commission as a ring physician in 2005, I started looking at horse racing. And thoroughbred racing is regulated exactly like boxing. It's state regulated and everyone had their own set of rules. And I started to realize that they were doing a lot more drug testing for the thoroughbreds and maybe even the jockeys than they were doing on our human combat athletes. And so it kind of came to my mind that there needed to be something set up as an informational source in addition to hopefully eventually a testing source. You know, my idea is hopefully that the commissions themselves will expand their testing, but right now very few commissions test for performance-enhancing drugs. There's a few that do, like California, Nevada, New York, New Jersey. Some of those states do, but their panels are antiquated and don't test for the right things, and so you're really not catching the individuals. So hopefully there'll be some uniformity to it down the road.
Well, let's talk about Las Vegas. This is the mecca of boxing. And we have so many championship fights. How's the testing? How is it run here?
Well, I think it's a lot better than it used to be. For example, when I was on the commission, we would really only test a fighter after the fight. Not every fighter was being tested. And as I understand, more and more athletes are being tested. I think in some instances they're testing every fighter on a card, which is great. But where I think that things need to be changed is they need to do much more than they're doing as far as unannounced testing. You know, and when they do unannounced testing, if you're giving an athlete 24 to 48 hours to show up at a lab, sometimes things can be out of their system by that time. So I think the testing really needs to be classic unannounced testing where someone just shows up on your doorstep, maybe just calls ahead and say, I'm on my way, and shows right up at your doorstep. And it needs to include blood and urine, and it needs to include things like erythropoietin or EPO, which is a blood booster that athletes will often use or abuse to increase their blood count. We need to look for human growth hormone. We need to do more stringent testosterone testing for anabolic steroids. So there's a lot of different things. The panels themselves need to be improved.
What is the difference though, with urine and blood? What will and won't urine show that perhaps blood will? And because I know blood, everybody tells me that if you're not doing blood, forget about it.
No, and that's not true. Urine testing can be more beneficial in many instances. For example, you need urine testing if you're testing for EPO. You can do it in the blood, but it's not going to really be able to differentiate synthetic from what's your own, erythropoietin levels. So you really have to do that in the urine to really be accurate. Human growth hormone has to be done through the blood. The other thing that you have to do in the blood is look at blood counts, because if you want to find out if someone's really blood doping, you have to see transitions or changes in someone's blood count. Is it increasing over a period of time? And so really the only way to do that is with blood, but most of the tests are urine tests. Bottom line is that if somebody is using testosterone and you go do a urine test for it, which is the test you want to do, not a blood test really, a urine test, you might miss it if they've got a normal TE ratio. But the test that we do, and we do it on every time we test an athlete, is the CIR test will discover whether or not somebody is using irrespective of that. And we can detect that much more easily than you can in a regular testosterone test. So our testing is very stringent, and we do unannounced random testing. So, we'll show up on somebody's door.
So it sounds like that's the key. What VADA is doing is the random testing, so you don't alert, would be like the police alerting the criminal. Yeah, and a combination of urine and blood, because it's gotten so damn sophisticated, as you're pointing out. I mean, how can a state regulation in West Virginia do the type of test that would really expose P.E.D. use? Well,
the bottom line too is you had mentioned when we were just chatting before this about Nonito Donaire, and he's the first athlete in boxing or in MMA to step up and do a 24/7, 365-day-a-year program where we can test him at any point at any time. And that way you can really follow an athlete. There is something called a biological passport that has been developed through the World Anti-Doping Agency, which will follow an athlete's parameters, such as their blood or their chemistries, and even for performance-enhancing drugs, you can follow them over time. But it's not been developed for the urine test that you need to do as well. So it's not quite there yet, but it will help with some things. But that's what you really need, is there to be uniformity. Like there needs to be uniformity in MRI testing, there needs to be uniformity in neuro exams, eye exams, and also in PED testing.
Nonito's a good friend of the show of mine, and I think it's fantastic that he's doing that. Explain though, how does this work? Does the fighter incur the cost? How does this work with VADA?
Well, it can be different. I mean, we're a nonprofit. It can be written off as a business expense. The athlete can donate. They can have sponsors that donate for them. We've had some instances where promoters have paid for the testing, so it can really vary. We've paid, some of the people on the board, including myself, has often paid for some of the testing. So that can vary.
Is it an expensive process?
It's an expensive process. Routine anabolic steroid panel, I think, can cost a couple $100. But one of the tests that we do, that CIR test, can be $450, so it's very expensive, but you're getting more bang for your buck.
It's interesting, because Lamont Peterson, who tested positive, he was on ESPN saying that he supports VADA, couldn't do it this last fight, and he brought that up. He said because it wasn't a money fight for him, otherwise he would love to go back. What do you think of a situation like his where he blamed it on a situation where he truly didn't know? He did test positive, but he said he was low on testosterone. Is that a situation? And that's, I guess, where the education or lack thereof comes in.
Yes. I mean, bottom line is, and that's another whole aspect of what the importance of VADA is, that an athlete needs to know what they're putting in their body. And that was another reason why we created this, was that we felt that more often than not, the athletes didn't know what they were taking, why they were taking it. Someone was either giving it to them or telling them it would help, and they didn't really understand what was illegal and what was not, what was prohibited and what is not. And so obviously it comes down to the athlete themselves. I mean, a doping offense is a doping offense, whether you did it intentionally or not. It's just like if you run through a stop sign and a cop stops you, it doesn't matter if you didn't see it. So it's the important thing is for them to know what's legal and not. And so it comes down to them. But that's one other thing that we want to do. We also offer assistance for athletes that have been using drugs, especially performance-enhancing drugs. We have a psychiatrist, psychologist, part of our group that's willing to counsel them and help them seek help when they need, because it's sometimes withdrawing off of some of this stuff is just as bad as withdrawing off of other, you know, illegal drugs. So it can be very difficult. So we want to have some kind of resource for them, and it's obviously anonymous, and they can contact these individuals. So
You've been around this sport a long time. You've been around a lot of high-profile fighters. How big a problem do you think performance-enhancing drugs is in boxing right now?
I don't think I can answer that. I think it's a big problem. To say any kind of percentage would be ridiculous because I don't have that information. And, you know, sometimes people say, well, you know, one thing that I would always hear was that fighters would come up to me and say, you know, I've heard so-and-so's using this or so-and-so's using that, and who's to say whether that's true or not. But I hear all the time that these things are available in the gyms. They just did a study at the University of Minnesota that came out the end of last year, and it showed that up to 7% of teens, average age, I think 15 or 14, were using anabolic steroids. And I think it was up 4.5% of girls, average age 14 or 15, were using anabolic steroids. So that tells you there's a problem that's being ignored and not dealt with. And that's where it's starting. And, you know, and all these boxers and MMA athletes, I mean, they're supposed to be people that these kids can look up to. And if they're using these drugs, it's just like in the problems they're having in baseball. You know, if they're using these drugs, then what kind of benefit is that to these kids? They're going to think they need to do the exact same thing.
Well, greater than that, too. You're right, because in baseball it affects the integrity, you know, whether or not Hank Aaron's the home run king or Barry Bonds. In football, it certainly can lead to probably more serious injuries because the guys are bigger, stronger. But in boxing or MMA, you're talking about it could life or death.
Well, it's always that way. I mean, these sports are inherently dangerous, and then you add performance-enhancing drugs to the mix, it makes it that much worse. So yeah, the importance is there, and you know, the athletes should serve as examples to these young people, especially now we're seeing with MMA, they're starting to have programs for younger kids in high school, I believe. So it's even more important that the athletes serve as examples of good things and not bad things like that.
You know, you have a trained eye, you've been around the sport a long time, and I got to ask you the questions. We're in a social media world now. Manny Pacquiao has been under suspicion forever in a day. When you look at Manny Pacquiao, from when he started, I don't know whether you worked any of his fights or not, but till now, obviously that, I mean, it according to Floyd, that's why he didn't fight him. It was because, or when you look at a guy like Juan Manuel Marquez, who in his fourth fight scored 2 knockdowns and knocked Manny Pacquiao out cold and came in chiseled, not even looking almost like the same guy. With your eye, does it raise concern? Does it raise an eyebrow as this guy should be under suspicion because of the body and the look and the things that we know about guys at that age?
Well, let me put it a different way. I mean, I think it's sad that there is a suspicion out there on any of these fighters. I can't tell you who was using and who was not unless, you know, you've got positive tests. But I think that one thing that's important to understand is it may not always be the chiseled guy. That a lot of these drugs don't necessarily make somebody come in and look superhuman or make it so that they can change weight classes or add muscle mass. A lot of these drugs just change their endurance or help their ability to recover from injury. And I think that's when a lot of them are being used, is just to recover from injury. So I think that if we hang our hat on just what someone's appearance is or not, then we're really missing the boat. I think that I don't want to say that every athlete, of course they're not, under suspicion of using performance-enhancing drugs, but I think that it's not always the picture of the person that we imagine. You know, years ago, I think it was around 2001 or 2002 when VADA started a short pilot program before they actually started testing for anabolic steroids. And the commission really debated doing it. And the reason why they debated doing it was they said, well, it's only the heavyweights that are going to use these drugs, or it's only the big muscle guys that we see are using these drugs. And that just certainly isn't the case. You can see it in the smaller weighted fighters. You can see it in the fighters that don't have a lot of muscle mass. They're maybe using diuretics to lose weight, which is another problem. Or they're using the diuretics to mask anabolic steroids. And so it may not be somebody that looks like this fit, muscular person. Sure, a lot of these drugs can make you look better, but a lot of them just change your endurance level.
It seems to me like, with what we've spoken about already, that the promoters, the networks, the states, that everybody should get involved, and there should be maybe satellite programs of a VADA set up that, it's certainly for championship fights and things where, the integrity of the sport's involved. It just seems to me, with what you're explaining, it's just gotten too sophisticated for states to regulate it without bringing something in like, what you folks do.
No, I completely agree. And like I said, this is not anything that's that unusual. It's just that I think what we're trying to do is shine the light on the problem more than it's been looked at before. And I think by the very fact that you're discussing this with me shows that people are talking about it. And obviously, you hear everything on the news constantly with labs and businesses in Florida and Lance Armstrong and all of that. It's on the public's mind. But for years, people just didn't think that boxing would be a sport that would involve themselves in this. And every sport is at risk for this because everyone wants to excel, everyone wants to do better. I mean, it's just inherent in the competitive nature. But I think what athletes need to learn is that they can do it clean. They don't need to use all this stuff to be successful. And by some examples, you can look back to somebody like Fernando Vargas. I mean, it doesn't prevent you from getting knocked out. So it can help you with a lot of different things, but maybe in the end, it doesn't protect you from the severe injuries. Does it help you win most of the time? I'm sure it can, but I think the risks are really too great, and I think it's up to the fighters to understand what the risks are, and that's the main thing that VADA really wants to do.
Or what would you like to see the future of VADA be?
I would like to see us be a resource. I don't necessarily feel that VADA needs to be what we are right now, which is a way for athletes to volunteer, to stand up for clean sport, which I think is wonderful. And I think that, boxing and MMA with VADA are really the only sport where that exists, where athletes can volunteer for P.E.D testing right now. I mean, I think that's all well and good, and maybe that'll continue and grow. But I think that what's the most important thing that VADA can do, or any organization like this can do, is really educate the commissions, educate the public, and put more teeth behind the need to instill really good testing in boxing and in MMA. That's kind of what I would hope would continue. And if it doesn't continue past this, there's nothing I can do about it, but at least people are starting to talk about it. And I think the athletes themselves, which are really intelligent individuals, which don't get enough credit. I remember when I started in boxing, and I used to talk to fighters at the weigh-in, and they would write down on their sheet, what they should be and not taking. They'll write down aspirin or Motrin. And I'd sit there and I'd say, why are you taking aspirin before your fight? And they go, well, I hurt my shoulder, I hurt this. And I said, don't you know that if you're in a fight and you get cut, or you get a bloody nose, or you start to get a swollen eye, it's going to be 10 times as worse because you've been taking aspirin. And they didn't know that. And I remember the trainer used to come over and say, don't talk to my fighter about that. It's going to make them nervous, and they're going to think about it during the fight, and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, but he's the one that needs to know. It's his life. And so I think in the end, that's what I hope VADA will be more of, is a way to educate the athletes so that they can have a resource to learn about this in an easy way that's applicable to their sport. What do they need to know? What shouldn't they take? Which person is a good conditioning guy? Which isn't? Which is, what kind of diet should I have? How should I properly lose weight? And I think that, performance-enhancing drugs is part of that. But if we can be a part of that, to me, that would be wonderful.
I call them the most common and uncommon of all athletes. And you certainly have been one that has been a great support system for the fighters, still are, with the great work you're doing with VADA. Keep up the great work. And damn it, we miss your red hair at ringside. Now I have the best hair in boxing.
You do. You have great hair.